The grand tapestries and ancient stone corridors of the British monarchy have witnessed centuries of calculated whispers and silent successions, yet nothing could have prepared the institution for the earthquake that recently rattled its very foundations. To the outside world, the transition of power appeared as a rehearsed ballet of tradition, a smooth and united front, with Prince William stepping toward his destiny, flanked by the unwavering support of the royal household. But behind those heavy, gilded doors, a far more dangerous reality was unfolding, a quiet internal war marked by divided loyalties and surgical maneuvers that no one saw coming. The most disciplined and duty-bound member of the family, Princess Anne, has just executed a move so bold and so final that it has sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of global power. Without raising her voice or making a single public declaration, she has effectively altered the course of royal history. For weeks, the machinery of the palace had been humming with the intricate preparations for the future, specifically the coronation planning for the Prince of Wales. In this high-stakes environment, information is the ultimate currency, and invitations to strategy meetings are the markers of true authority. However, as confidential briefings and high-level memos began to circulate among the inner circle, a glaring omission became impossible to ignore. One name was missing from every document, every digital thread, and every secure briefing. Queen Consort Camilla had been quietly, systematically, and completely cut out. This was not a clerical error or a scheduling oversight. It was a deliberate act of exclusion, carried out with a level of precision that only someone with the stature of the Princess Royal could command. The shock of this exclusion was magnified by the way it was discovered. There was no formal meeting to explain the change, no official notice sent to her offices at Clarence House. Instead, the Queen Consort found out by accident. Members of her own loyal staff, confused by the sudden silence from the planning committees, reportedly questioned why a key memo, one that should have crossed her desk, automatically never arrived. That was the moment the mask of palace unity slipped, revealing a deep and jagged rift. The emotional impact was immediate and severe. Those close to the situation describe a sense of profound betrayal, not just by a sister-in-law, but by the very system Camilla believed she had finally conquered through years of patient image repair and service. The message echoed through the ancient halls with chilling clarity. The firm had drawn a new boundary, and the Queen Consort was standing firmly on the wrong side of it. While the public sees a family united in grief and duty, the internal reality is a power struggle of epic proportions. Princess Anne has long been the steady, unmovable force of the monarchy, and her decision to block Camilla from the inner sanctum of William's future reign suggests a seismic shift in the royal hierarchy. Was this a protective shield thrown around a future king, or the final eruption of a tension that has been simmering for decades? As we peel back the layers of this royal drama, we must ask, what finally pushed the most stoic princess in history to take such an uncompromising stand? And is this the beginning of a permanent exile for the woman currently wearing the crown? One thing is certain, the battle for the future of the monarchy has begun, and the rules of engagement have just been rewritten in the shadows. To understand the ferocity of this current divide, one must look beneath the polished surface of modern royal life and into the ironclad principles of the woman known as the monarchy's backbone. Princess Anne has never been one for the fleeting charms of public relations or the desperate chase for media approval. Her life is a testament to the old ways, a lifetime of service carried out with a quiet, unmovable discipline that demands respect from everyone within the palace walls. She is the steady force that keeps the heavy structure of the crown upright, and she expects nothing less than total devotion to tradition from those around her. This is why her tension with Queen Camilla was never a simple matter of personal dislike or petty rivalry. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies that has been building for more than 40 years. For Anne, the crown is a sacred burden, something that is worn through decades of silent sacrifice and unwavering adherence to rank. She watched as Camilla rose from the ashes of a public scandal to the position of Queen Consort, a journey powered not by the traditional path of service, but by a carefully managed campaign of image rehabilitation. To the Princess Royal, this felt like an erosion of the very principles she spent her life defending. While other senior members of the family made visible efforts to welcome Camilla into the fold, Anne remained a fortress of cool, distant politeness. She limited her interactions to what protocol strictly required, offering no warm gestures or public displays of affection. It was a measured silence that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read the language of the court. Anne believes deeply that status within the firm must be earned through a lifetime of work, not reshaped by public sympathy or clever media strategies. Insiders recall a private moment following a summer event at Balmoral that perfectly captures this divide. Anne is said to have remarked to a trusted confidant that some people wear the crown for duty, while others wear it merely for appearance. Though she mentioned no names, everyone in the room knew exactly who she was referencing. This belief only intensified when her brother ascended the throne. Anne watched with increasing concern as Camilla's influence appeared to grow at a rapid pace. The queen consort became more assertive in protocol discussions and more vocal during ceremonial planning. To the world, it might have looked like a woman coming into her own, but to Anne, it was a dangerous overreach. She saw a woman attempting to rewrite her role in the monarchy rather than accepting the strict limits that tradition imposes on a consort. The tension was not just psychological, it manifested in sharp, physical corrections that few outsiders truly noticed. At one high-profile diplomatic reception, Camilla reportedly attempted to take the lead in a conversation with a foreign envoy, a role traditionally reserved for the sovereign or those born into the bloodline. Anne did not hesitate for a single second. She firmly interrupted the exchange, redirecting the conversation herself and subtly putting the queen consort back in her place. It was not an act of cruelty in Anne's mind, but a necessary structural correction. She viewed these moments as a defense of the institution itself. Behind closed doors, she began to voice her concerns that the hierarchy was being blurred by those who did not truly respect the weight of the history they were stepping into. This long, simmering friction reached a boiling point as the planning for the next generation began. Anne began holding private, confidential audiences with Prince William, sharing her fears that the line between symbolic support and real influence was becoming dangerously thin. She warned the future king that if Camilla were allowed to shape the foundational decisions of his coronation and his future reign, the delicate balance of authority within the institution would be permanently destabilized. These conversations were not about punishment, they were about protection. Anne viewed Camilla's expanding presence not as a reinforcement of the throne, but as a potential challenge to its long-term survival. She was planting the seeds of a quiet revolution, convincing William that the future of the monarchy depended on his ability to stand alone, shielded by tradition rather than overshadowed by those who sought to rewrite their roles for the sake of public perception. Anne's message was final. The crown must remain a symbol of duty, and anyone who treated it as a stage for personal influence had to be stopped. The air inside the private sitting rooms of Clarence House has often been described by those who work there as heavy, thick, with the weight of centuries-old secrets and the lingering scent of beeswax and ancient wood. It is a place where history is not just remembered but lived, where every painting on the wall seems to watch the present with a critical, unforgiving eye. On a late afternoon just a few weeks ago, that heaviness reached a suffocating peak. Prince William did not enter the room as a grieving son or a polite stepson seeking a casual conversation over tea. He entered as the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, and a man who had finally decided that the polite fictions of the past could no longer survive the pressures of the future. The tension that had been building between him and Queen Camilla for years, a tension that had lived in the quiet spaces between forced smiles and rehearsed public appearances, was about to erupt into a confrontation that would redefine the hierarchy of the British monarchy. For William, this moment had been a long time coming. He had spent months watching from the sidelines as Camilla's influence within the palace began to shift from supportive to assertive. He saw it in the way she positioned herself in ceremonial photographs, the way she spoke with an increasing sense of ownership over palace protocol, and the way she seemed to be quietly carving out a legacy that William believed belonged only to those of the direct bloodline. To the public, William remained the picture of measured restraint, but behind closed doors, the pressure of protecting his future reign was becoming an unbearable burden. He realized that if he did not set a boundary now, the very identity of his future coronation would be diluted by the influence of a woman whose path to the crown was, in his eyes, fundamentally different from his own. When the two sat down, the silence was immediate and absolute. There were no pleasantries, no inquiries about the children or the king's health. William spoke first, his voice carrying the calm, cold authority of a man who had already made up his mind. He began by acknowledging the complexities of the current transition, but he quickly moved to the heart of the matter. He explained, with a courtesy that felt as sharp as a blade, that the planning for his own coronation was now underway in earnest. He made it clear that this event was not merely a continuation of the present, but a foundational statement for the future of the monarchy, his future. Therefore, he requested that Camilla step back from all key planning committees, particularly those involving the symbolic and ceremonial decisions that would define the visual and moral language of his reign. He was not asking for her opinion, he was informing her of a new reality. He spoke about the need for space, the need for the public to see a clear and distinct vision of the future king and queen. He argued that her presence in these specific, high-level strategy meetings was beginning to feel intrusive, a distraction from the message of continuity and renewal that he and Catherine were working so hard to cultivate. It was a request delivered with the kind of restraint that William had mastered over a lifetime of public scrutiny, yet the underlying message was undeniable. Her era was a bridge, and he was the destination. He wanted her to understand that while she was the queen consort today, she would not be the architect of tomorrow. Camilla, however, was not prepared to be lectured by the boy she had watched grow into a man. She had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of public opinion, fighting her way from the most hated woman in Britain to the side of the king. She believed she had earned her place at the table through endurance and loyalty, and she was not about to let the heir to the throne brush her aside like a temporary guest. As William spoke, she reportedly maintained a polite, almost glacial smile, but those close to her say her eyes remained fixed on him with a dangerous intensity. When he finished, she did not respond with anger or defensive arguments. Instead, she chose a weapon far more potent: dismissal. With a tone that blended soft amusement and a patronizing edge, she leaned forward and replied with a single, devastating sentence. "It is all symbolic tradition, darling, nothing more." To Camilla, she was perhaps trying to de-escalate the situation by making it seem as though William was overreacting to minor details. But to William, the word darling was a condescending slap in the face, and her dismissal of symbolic tradition was an insult to the very institution he was sworn to protect. It suggested that his future, his burden, and the sacred rituals of the crown were nothing more than a theatrical performance that she found quaint. That was the moment something in the Prince of Wales finally snapped. The years of suppressed resentment, the memories of his mother's pain, and the overwhelming weight of his current responsibilities converged into a single, explosive realization. There could be no middle ground. Breaking from his usual diplomatic restraint, William stood up, his presence filling the room with a sudden, sharp energy. He looked directly at the woman who had spent so long trying to win his favor, and delivered a sentence that insiders say still echoes through the corridors of the palace. "This is not your crown to shape." The words fell with a heavy, final thud. There was no shouting, no dramatic exchange of insults, just a silence so profound it felt as though the very walls of Clarence House were holding their breath. William did not wait for a response. He did not wait for an apology or an explanation. He simply turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing on the polished floorboards. He had drawn the line in the sand, and he had done so with a clarity that left no room for negotiation. The very next day, William sought out the one person he knew would understand the gravity of what had just occurred. He met privately with Princess Anne, the only member of the family whose devotion to the crown surpassed even his own. He recounted the meeting, the dismissal, and the darling that had been the final straw. Anne did not need to be convinced. She saw in William's resolve the same iron discipline that she had lived by her entire life. Together, they formed a silent pact. The exclusion of Camilla from the coronation planning would no longer be a suggestion. It would be a coordinated, surgical reality. From that moment on, the palace machinery shifted gears. Meetings were rescheduled without Camilla's knowledge. Guest lists were vetted by William's personal advisors. Key strategy documents were rerouted through secure channels that bypassed her office entirely. It was a masterpiece of internal maneuvering, a realignment of power that happened so quietly and so efficiently that for several days, the queen consort had no idea she had been erased from the future. When she finally realized the extent of the betrayal, the fury that erupted within the walls of Clarence House was unlike anything the staff had ever witnessed. But by then, the gates had already been closed. William had reclaimed his territory, and with Anne by his side, he had ensured that the crown he would one day wear would be shaped by his vision and his vision alone. The fight for the soul of the monarchy had moved into a new, more ruthless phase, and for the first time in her long journey, Camilla was finding herself on the outside looking in. The mechanics of power within the palace often operate like a clockwork engine, hidden, silent, and terrifyingly efficient. When Princess Anne and Prince William decided to move forward with the exclusion of Queen Camilla, they did not resort to public arguments or dramatic ultimatums. Instead, they utilized the very bureaucracy that Camilla had once used to secure her own position. This was the surgical exclusion, a strategic maneuver designed to erase her influence from the coronation planning without leaving a single fingerprint on the weapon. It was a masterpiece of internal statecraft, executed by a small, elite group of advisors who answered only to the bloodline royals. The first phase of the operation focused on the digital and physical flow of information. For months, Camilla's office at Clarence House had been part of every major email chain and distribution list regarding the transition. That changed within 48 hours of William's confrontation with her. A new, secondary layer of communication was established, one that excluded the Queen Consort's private secretaries and senior aides. Meeting agendas were quietly revised. The official calendar remained unchanged, but the real discussions were moved to private residences or secure rooms within Kensington Palace. When Camilla's team reached out for updates, they were met with polite, vague responses from William's staff, citing administrative delays or ongoing internal reviews. It was a classic case of being ghosted by the crown. Anne's role in this was instrumental. She understood the intricacies of palace protocol better than anyone alive. She knew exactly which documents required a consort's signature and which ones could be bypassed under the guise of sovereign prerogative. She guided William's team in rerouting sensitive correspondence through the Duchy of Cornwall channels, effectively shielding the plans from the eyes of those loyal to Camilla. Even the guest lists for the preliminary strategy sessions were scrutinized with a level of intensity usually reserved for state funerals. Every name was vetted for loyalty. If an individual was suspected of leaking information back to Camilla's circle, they were quietly reassigned to other duties or left off the invitation list entirely. The loyalty of William's inner circle was absolute. These were men and women who viewed themselves as the vanguard of a new era, and they saw Anne's leadership as the ultimate validation of their mission. They operated with a sense of purpose that made them immune to the subtle pressures usually exerted by the Queen Consort's office. When Camilla's senior advisors attempted to assert their authority, they found themselves hitting a wall of polite but immovable resistance. The young guard, as some palace insiders called them, were following a blueprint laid out by the Princess Royal herself, and they did so with a level of discretion that made it impossible for Camilla to mount a counteroffensive. Inside Clarence House, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to a cold, creeping dread. Camilla's staff began to notice the subtle signs of their isolation. The phones, which usually rang with constant updates from the planning committees, grew quiet. Key invitations to working lunches failed to arrive. Memos that were once shared daily became weekly, then stopped altogether. It was a psychological war as much as a political one. The Queen Consort's aides, many of whom had spent years building her influence, found themselves standing on a shrinking island of relevance. They could see the horizon of the future, but they were no longer being invited to sail toward it. This was not merely about logistics. It was about the fundamental realignment of power. By cutting Camilla out of the coronation planning, Anne and William were sending a message to the entire royal household. The era of the consort's dominance was over. The authority now resided with the heir and the sister of the king. The surgical exclusion had worked perfectly. Camilla was still queen, she still wore the jewelry, and she still attended the public engagements. But in the rooms where the future was being written, her seat had been removed, and the door had been locked from the inside. The institution had corrected itself, and it had done so with a cold, terrifying efficiency that left no room for appeal. Through these silent maneuvers, the duo had ensured that the foundation of the next reign would be built on their terms, leaving the Queen Consort to wonder how she had lost the game she thought she had already won. As the whispers of Camilla's exclusion grew into a deafening silence within the palace walls, a different kind of presence began to take hold, one that did not need to shout to be heard. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, did not step into the void left by the Queen Consort with a flourish of trumpets or a demand for recognition. Instead, she occupied the space with a calm, effortless authority that felt as natural as the sunrise. While others were embroiled in a desperate struggle for influence, Catherine was quietly becoming the very heart of the operation. She did not ask for a seat at the table. The table was built around her. Senior palace staff later observed that her role in these early coronation meetings was far from symbolic. She was not there to simply nod and smile. She was there to lead, to refine, and to ground the future king in a reality that felt both ancient and entirely new. Catherine brought a vision to the table that was both deeply respectful of the past and boldly focused on the future. She understood that a coronation in the modern age could not merely be a repeat of centuries-old rituals. It had to resonate with a generation that viewed the monarchy with a skeptical eye. It was Catherine who suggested that young people from across the four nations should have a visible and active role in the procession, giving the future a literal place in the most sacred of moments. It was Catherine who proposed a way to honor the late Queen Elizabeth II that felt like a bridge rather than a ghost, blending the legacy of the longest reigning monarch with the fresh purpose of the new era. Her ideas were not forced. They were thoughtful, intentional, and perfectly aligned with the weight of the crown. The contrast between Catherine and Camilla was becoming impossible to ignore. Where Camilla's actions were increasingly viewed through the lens of strategy and overreach, Catherine moved with an ease that met no resistance. Her influence was not announced because it did not need to be. It was felt in every decision made and every tone set. Palace aides described the working relationship between William and Catherine as a partnership of equals, a rare occurrence in the history of the firm. Where William brought the necessary strength and historical gravity, Catherine brought a much-needed balance and a lightness of touch. They did not operate through rank or command. They operated through a shared vision. One insider noted that the two worked as if they were a single mind, moving toward a future that they were building together, brick by brick, without the need for external validation. Beyond the palace gates, the public's response to Catherine's ascent was quiet but undeniable. After years of scandal, internal rifts, and public fatigue, the people found a sense of grounding comfort in her presence. She felt authentic in a way that the carefully managed image of the queen consort never quite achieved. Catherine was polished, yet relatable, elegant without being aloof, and beautiful without the need to push herself into the center of the frame. Polling numbers, though rarely discussed openly within the inner circle, confirmed what the advisors already knew. The public was not responding to titles or bloodlines anymore. They were responding to character. Catherine was becoming the symbol of trust that the monarchy desperately needed to survive the coming decades. What made her rise even more striking was the total lack of competition. Catherine never tried to replace Camilla. She simply embodied what the monarchy was evolving toward. While the queen consort fought to remain seen, Catherine was content to be significant. She understood that in the language of the court, silence is often the loudest statement of power. Behind the heavy oak doors, as the balance of authority shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways, the truth became clear to everyone watching closely. The future queen was not waiting for a crown to define her. She was already behaving like a sovereign, her influence sealing the fate of the institution long before the first notes of the coronation anthem would ever be played. In the quiet shift from the old guard to the new, Catherine had become the anchor, leaving the queen consort to drift further into the shadows of a history that was no longer hers to write. The walls of Windsor Castle have stood for nearly 1,000 years, witnessing the rise and fall of dynasties, the whispers of revolution, and the quiet, agonizing decisions of sovereigns who found themselves trapped between the demands of the heart and the requirements of the state. Inside a secluded library, far from the prying eyes of the court and the constant hum of the modern world, King Charles sat alone. The weight of time seemed to press more heavily upon him in these moments of stillness. For decades, he had waited for the crown, believing that when the moment finally arrived, his authority would be absolute, his family united, and his legacy secure. But as he looked out over the sprawling estate, the reality felt far narrower and more unforgiving than he had ever imagined. He was a man caught in the middle of a storm he could no longer control, and the person he relied on most for emotional stability, Queen Camilla, was being systematically erased from the future he was trying to build. The meeting he had called was not a formal state occasion, but it carried the gravity of a declaration of war. When Princess Anne entered the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. She did not walk with the hesitation of a younger sibling, or the deference of a subject. She walked with the stride of someone who had spent 7 decades preparing for this exact moment of reckoning. There were no warm greetings, no shared memories of their childhood at Clarence House. The silence between them was thick, a physical barrier that Charles found increasingly difficult to penetrate. He had spent several days under the intense pressure of Camilla's fury and her tears. She had described her exclusion from William's coronation planning as a public humiliation, a betrayal that cut deeper than any tabloid headline ever could. And now, Charles had to confront the architect of that exclusion. The king began to speak, his voice carrying a tremor of emotion that he could not entirely suppress. He did not speak as a monarch issuing a command, but as a husband pleading for the dignity of his wife. He spoke of loyalty, of the 40 years of judgment and scrutiny Camilla had endured to stand by his side. He reminded Anne of the patient work they had done to rebuild the queen consort's image, to move her from the shadows of scandal into the light of public service. "She is my wife," he reportedly said, the words hanging in the air like a desperate plea. It was a declaration of personal devotion, an appeal to the shared history of a family that had survived so much. To Charles, this was about redemption. It was about ensuring that the woman he loved was not cast aside just as they had reached the summit of their journey. But Princess Anne did not come to Windsor to discuss feelings or to offer comfort. She remained standing, her posture as rigid and unyielding as the stone walls around them. Her reply was firm, calm, and devastatingly final. She did not argue against Camilla's character, nor did she deny the work that had been done to rehabilitate her image. Instead, she spoke the language of the institution, a language that Charles, in his emotional distress, seemed to have forgotten. She reminded him that the monarchy does not belong to the individuals who wear the crowns. It belongs to the history that precedes them and the future that must follow them. "He is our future," she said, referring to William. The statement was not just a reminder of the line of succession. It was a cold acknowledgement of where the real power now resided. Anne's argument was structural. She explained that for the monarchy to survive the modern age, the transition to William's reign had to be seen as a clean, untainted progression. Any perceived overreach by a consort, especially one with such a complex history, would only serve to weaken the foundations of the throne at a time when the public's patience was at its thinnest. She told her brother, with a chilling lack of apology, that her loyalty was not to his personal happiness, but to the crown itself. She had seen the way Camilla had begun to shape ceremonial matters, and she had decided, along with the Prince of Wales, that the boundary had to be drawn now, before the precedent became permanent. Charles sat in a long, uneasy silence. The harsher reality was finally sinking in. His influence was no longer what it once was. He had reached the throne only to find that the most significant decisions regarding the future were being made by his sister and his son, often without his direct input. The pageant of contradiction that Anne feared was already beginning to take shape, and she was the only one willing to use the knife to cut it away. He looked at his sister and saw not a sibling, but a guard at the gate, steady and unmoved by his emotional appeals. When the conversation died, there were no efforts at reconciliation. Anne simply gave a brief, respectful nod, a gesture of protocol rather than affection, and walked away. No closing remarks were made to soften the blow. Charles was left in the gathering shadows of the library, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than ever. He had failed to change her mind because he was fighting for a person, while Anne was fighting for a 1,000-year-old idea. In that moment, the king understood a painful truth. Power in the monarchy is borrowed through tradition and protected by those willing to sacrifice everything, even family harmony, to ensure its survival. The meeting ended, and with it, the illusion that Charles could protect Camilla from the rising tide of the next generation. The silent storm had claimed its first major victory, and the king was left to face the consequences alone. In the high-stakes world of royal diplomacy, where every gesture is choreographed and every word is weighed for its historical impact, the most powerful weapons are often those that never leave the shadows. For decades, the public has been fed a diet of carefully curated press releases and staged photographs, but the true history of the firm is written in private. In a stunning turn of events that has left even the most seasoned palace insiders breathless, a private letter written by Princess Anne has surfaced through the most discreet of channels. It was a document never intended for the eyes of the public, or even for the wider royal household. It was a stark, unflinching message from a sister to a king, and its contents cut straight to the bone of the crisis currently consuming the House of Windsor. The letter was written in the quiet hours of a cold Tuesday morning, weeks before the world realized that Queen Camilla had been effectively sidelined from the future. Princess Anne, sitting at her desk at Gatcombe Park, chose to bypass the usual digital security and formal secretaries. She wrote by hand, her script as disciplined and sharp as her personality. This act alone signaled the gravity of her intent. When the Princess Royal takes up a pen, it is not for a casual exchange, it is to issue a decree of conscience. The letter, which eventually made its way into the hands of King Charles, reveals a woman deeply terrified that the institution she has spent 70 years defending is slowly, almost imperceptibly, losing its soul. Anne began the letter by acknowledging the heavy burden of tradition that they both inherited from their mother. She spoke of the crown not as an ornament of prestige, but as a relentless duty that demands the sacrifice of personal desires. However, it was her warning about the present state of the monarchy that carried the most sting. She described the current trajectory of the palace as a slow descent into what she chillingly termed a pageant of contradiction. To Anne, a pageant is a hollow spectacle, a show put on for an audience that lacks the substance of true leadership. She argued that when appearances begin to matter more than purpose, the foundation of the throne begins to rot from within. Though she never mentioned Camilla by name within the 3 pages of the letter, the target of her critique was unmistakable. Anne wrote about the poison of public perception and how the pursuit of media approval had led the monarchy to make compromises that would have been unthinkable in previous generations. She was referencing the decades-long campaign to rehabilitate Camilla's image, a project she viewed as a dangerous distraction from the monarchy's true calling. To Anne, the monarchy does not exist to be liked. It exists to be stable, to be permanent, and to be a symbol of national responsibility that stands above the fickle winds of popular opinion. She warned Charles that by allowing personal relationships to dictate the shape of ceremonial duties, he was risking the one thing the monarchy cannot afford to lose: its mystery and its integrity. The most profound section of the letter focused on the next generation. Anne described Thunvung William as the last strong pillar of the family, a man who managed to combine the ironclad respect for tradition with a necessary vision for the future. Her confidence in William was absolute, but it came with a dark caveat. She warned her brother that if William's path were to be cluttered by the competing interests and overreaching influences of the present, the pillar would eventually crack under the pressure. She urged Charles to see that the future of the crown now rested not on his own reign, which she viewed as a transitional period, but on the strength and clarity of his son's eventual ascension. The letter reached its climax with a demand that was as painful as it was necessary. Anne argued that for the institution to survive, Charles had to be willing to let go. This was not a request for him to abdicate, but a plea for him to step back from the personal battles of his wife and allow the Prince of Wales the space to define the monarchy for the 21st century. She spoke of the loneliness of the crown, a burden their mother had carried with such stoic grace, and reminded him that this loneliness often requires pushing away those closest to you to protect the greater good. Letting go of Camilla's influence in the planning of the future was, in Anne's eyes, the only way to prevent the pageant from turning into a farce. This letter was the blueprint for the surgical exclusion that followed. It provided the moral and strategic justification for William to take his uncompromising stand. When Charles read those words, he wasn't just reading the thoughts of his sister. He was reading the collective anxieties of the old guard and the silent hopes of the new. The letter revealed that the internal war was not about petty jealousy or ancient grudges. It was a desperate struggle to save an ancient idea from the modern world's hunger for celebrity. As the details of this correspondence began to leak into the highest circles of the palace, the reaction was one of stunned silence. No one had expected Anne to be so blunt, so final, but for the Princess Royal, the time for subtlety had passed. She had seen the cracks forming in the palace walls and chose to use her voice to call for a radical realignment. Her message was a cold shower for a king who had spent too long trying to balance his heart and his crown. The survival of the monarchy, she argued, required a sacrifice of the personal for the sake of the eternal. And as the world watches the fallout of Camilla's exile, they are seeing the direct result of a sister's unwavering belief that some things, especially the Vung Mien, are far too important to be shared with anyone who does not truly understand the weight of the bloodline. Anne's letter was the final closing of the door, and in the silence that followed, the future of the British monarchy began to take a much harder, more disciplined shape. The dust may eventually settle over the ancient stones of Windsor and the polished floors of Clarence House, but the institution of the monarchy has been irrevocably changed. What we have witnessed is not merely a family dispute, but a seismic realignment of power that has left Queen Camilla standing in the cold, facing the reality of a quiet exile. Princess Anne's calculated resistance and Prince William's sharp defiance have signaled the end of an era where a consort's influence could bridge the gap between tradition and personal desire. The message from the bloodline is final. The future belongs to those who embody the duty of the crown without compromise. As the planning for the next generation continues behind locked doors, the seat once reserved for Camilla remains empty, a symbolic void that speaks louder than any official statement. William and Catherine have stepped into the light, their partnership forming a new, unbreakable foundation for a monarchy that seeks authenticity over appearance. They are no longer waiting for the crown. They are already defining its moral and ceremonial borders. But we must ask, was Princess Anne's decisive move a necessary act of salvation for the monarchy, or was it a cold-hearted betrayal of a woman who had finally earned her place? Has the firm become too rigid in its pursuit of survival, or is this the only way to ensure the throne remains relevant in the 21st century? The cracks in the palace walls may be hidden from public view, but the internal divide is deep, and the consequences will be felt for decades to come. What do you think about the Princess Royal's actions toward the Queen Consort? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below. If you found this deep dive into the hidden power struggles of the royal family compelling, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more exclusive insights into the world's most famous dynasty. The story is far from over, and we will be here to witness every secret chapter.